Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the Salem witch trials. Let's first set the scene. These events occurred in 1692. This was only 72 years after the Pilgrims first landed in Plymouth. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was still a wild frontier. We usually just say Salem, but there were actually two communities, Salem Village and Salem Town. Salem Town was along the Atlantic coast. It was wealthier than Salem Village because of the transatlantic trade with England. Salem Village was a little inland and was a poor farming community. Most of the insanity occurred in Salem Village. When people visit present-day Salem, they go to what was Salem Town. The area that had been Salem Village is now comprised essentially in the town of Danvers. So, a lot of people miss the actual locations where these events occurred because there is no Salem Village now, and people do not think of Danvers, Massachusetts as the location where the witch hunt started. Although much of the witch hysteria was located in Salem Village, the actual trials were held in Salem Town, which is the present-day city of Salem. And Salem Town was where the executions took place. In 1752, Salem Village became an independent municipality and wanted to change their image, can't see why, from being known mainly for witch hunts. That's why they adopted the new name of Danvers. An important factor that led to the accusations was the small population. Everybody knew everybody. Salem Village consisted of only approximately 550 people, and Salem Town had only about 1,400 people in 1692. The people living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s were Puritans. Most people are familiar with that term because we tend to hear it around Thanksgiving. But who were the Puritans? These were people who believed that the Church of England was way too similar to the Roman Catholic Church. A group of Puritans moved to Holland in 1608 and in 1620 sailed to the New World and are now known as the Pilgrims. They set up the Plymouth colony. A decade later, another group of Puritans founded the separate Massachusetts Bay Colony. Salem Village and Salem Town were part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans were religious fanatics. They did not believe in any celebrations of Christmas or Easter. They thought of such festivities as being pagan rituals. The Puritans did not allow dancing. They did not allow music except for singing in church. There was not a lot of fun in Puritan communities such as Salem Village or Salem Town. They led very strict lives centered around their version of Christianity. Everybody in town was expected to go to church on Sunday as well as Wednesday. And Sunday masses would last around 3 hours. And most important for today's topic, these people believed in witches. I mean, truly believed in witches. There was no doubt that witches were real. The people of New England in the 1690s believed that the devil was not an evil being reigning in hell. The devil roamed the earth, particularly the forests of New England. The devil was an actual being having a real physical form. The devil would try to coerce people to worship him and do his bidding. These people became witches. Witches would sign the devil's book. A lot of these witches were illiterate, but they could just make their mark in the devil's book and the contract was complete. In exchange for their obedience, the devil would grant them some earthly delights and gave the witches some supernatural powers, including the capability to harm others. The Puritans based their lives on a literal interpretation of the Bible. One of the edicts they took very seriously is found in Exodus 22:18, which reads, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Now that we've set the scene, let's discuss the most important question usually asked. How many people were burned at the stake for being witches in 1692 in Salem? The answer is 0. Nobody was burned at the stake. This didn't mean that you would not be killed if you were convicted of being a witch. It's just that in 1600s New England, They hanged people for being a witch. They did not burn them. When we think of hanging as a form of execution, we think of the somewhat sophisticated manner they used in the 1800s, where the condemned person had a noose placed around their neck and then a trapdoor opened and they fell. Most of the times, the fall would snap their neck and kill them fairly quickly. But the hangings in the 1600s in New England were much worse. The nooses were just hung from a very sturdy tree branch. A ladder was placed against the branch, and the condemned person climbed up the ladder and had the noose placed around their neck. They were then simply pushed off of the ladder. There was not enough force to snap the person's neck, so they slowly twisted and were strangled to death. This was a much slower process and a very gruesome way to die. The delirium started in the household of Samuel Parris. He was a Puritan minister in Salem Village. Samuel Parris lived for a while on the Caribbean island of Barbados. When he returned to Boston, he brought his female slave Tituba with him. I'll tell you a lot more about her later on. The people that started the witch madness were two young girls. One was the daughter of the minister Samuel Parris. His daughter was named Elizabeth. She was 9 years old when the insanity began. Samuel Parris's niece also lived in their household. Her name was Abigail Williams. At the start of the witch hunts, she was 11 years old. In early 1692, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams started acting very strangely. They would roll around on the floor and scream as if they were in pain. They claimed that they were being physically tormented. They said that they were being pinched and stuck with pins. Since this was the 1690s in puritanical New England, the adults came to the logical conclusion that somebody was using witchcraft to torment these girls. In addition to Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, another key accuser soon joined in, Ann Putnam. She was 12 years old. Soon after Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams began exhibiting symptoms, so did Ann Putnam. She started having fits and claimed she was being tormented. When questioned, the three young girls said it was the Parris household slave Tituba who was bewitching them. Later, the three girls also accused two other women in town, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Things really got rolling when the girls accused Tituba of being a witch. In the records from that time, Tituba is always referred to as an Indian. That simply meant a native of the New World. She was actually born on the island of Barbados and, as I mentioned earlier, was brought to the Massachusetts Bay Colony by Samuel Parris to serve as his slave in his household. And in case you are surprised, yes, there was slavery in New England and all over the northern colonies. It may not have been as prevalent as it was in the southern colonies, but there was slavery throughout the northern colonies at that time. Tituba was an easy target. She was one of the few non-whites living in the community. She was a slave and had no rights, and she lived in the Parris household, so she was close to two of the girls who were accusing her. When Tituba was arrested and questioned by authorities, she was greatly encouraged to confess. You have to keep in mind that the Puritans were very, very big on confession as a way towards forgiveness. Apparently, Tituba understood that if she confessed, she might not be executed. So, she confessed. But a confession alone was not enough. The authorities wanted to know who else were witches. To use the parlance of the McCarthy trials of the 1950s, Tituba named names. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had already been accused by the three young girls of being witches, and so Tituba told the authorities that it was true. She said that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were tormenting the minister's daughter, niece, and Ann Putnam. As a result, Tituba was not executed, but she was imprisoned for over a year. This confinement occurred in a small, cramped jail, which was a wooden structure with no insulation, which was roasting in the summer and freezing in the winter, and the prisoners were provided very little food or any kind of creature comforts. And here's the craziest part. Prisoners had to pay for their food and the fresh straw which they used to sleep on. I'll give you one spoiler. Tituba survived the witch trials, but Samuel Parris would not pay for the prison version of room and board, so she could not be released. Eventually, Another person paid her bill, and she became a slave to that man. In short, Tituba was quite miserable for that year plus in jail, but at least she was not killed. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that she did the right thing by testifying against other people. I'm just explaining why we think she did it. Some people think that she confessed and accused those two other women because she was beaten by her slave owner, Samuel Parris. Tituba later claimed that she only confessed because of the beating from the minister. Growing up in the Caribbean where voodoo was common, Tituba supposedly believed in voodoo, witches, and magic. There's a theory that she had told Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams of voodoo and witchcraft, and that might have been where they first got the idea. We just don't know. I'll tell you a little more about Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne in a moment, but first I want to discuss a bizarre thing called witch cake. Early on in the witch hysteria of 1692, Tituba made what was called a witch cake. As she baked the cake, she added the urine of the afflicted young girls who were supposedly bewitched. She then fed the cake to a dog who was supposed to lead people to the witches who were tormenting the young girls. We have no information if the dog actually led them to the supposed witches or what the results were. So what did Tituba actually confess to doing? Tituba admitted that she participated in a ritual from the occult when she baked the witch cake, but she stated she only did it in an attempt to find out who was tormenting Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams. Tituba also testified that she spoke with the devil on several occasions. He took different forms, sometimes as a tall man with black hair and sometimes as a dog. The devil ordered Tituba to hurt the children, but she refused to sign his book. To seal the bargain, a person had to sign the devil's book, as I described earlier. So that's why Tituba made that distinction that she was not a full-fledged witch because she had not signed the devil's book. Tituba also testified that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were tormenting the young girls. So let's talk about the next two people accused of being witches, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Like Tituba, these two women were both easy targets, but for different reasons. They were not slaves, they were both white, but they were both on the fringes of society. Sarah Osborne was considered a social outcast because she did not go to church. Due to a long illness, she missed church for almost 3 years. This was unforgivable in Puritan New England in the 1600s. Also, when her husband died, she married her servant, and this was considered scandalous. Before she could be convicted, Sarah Osborne died in jail on May 10, 1692, at 49 years old. We don't know exactly how she died, but it appears to be due to whatever ailments she had been suffering for years, along with the poor conditions of the jail. Amazingly, Sarah Osborne's home still exists. It was built in 1660 and is currently a private home in the town of Danvers, Massachusetts. As I explained earlier, Salem Village changed its name to Danvers because of the horrible publicity from the witch trials. Sarah Good was an outcast because she was very poor. She and her husband did not own a home and were considered as beggars, and so therefore looked down upon by the other townsfolk of Salem Village. Sarah Good claimed her innocence, but was found guilty nonetheless and was hanged. The amazing part of Sarah Good's story involves her daughter, who was also accused of being a witch and was jailed. Why was this remarkable? Because Sarah's daughter, Dorothy Good, was only 4 years old at the time. That's right, they detained a 4-year-old on suspicion of witchcraft. While she was jailed, she was frightened, she was away from her mother, so she confessed to everything that the investigators asked of her, including saying that her mother performed witchcraft and that she herself did. Considering the hysteria of the time, it's surprising that they did not hang this 4-year-old. But it's not a happy ending. Even though 4-year-old Dorothy did not hang, she was jailed for almost 9 months. And she also lost her mother, who was executed for being a convicted witch. By some accounts, Dorothy was mentally unstable when she was released from jail and remained so for the rest of her life. let's talk a little bit about the trials. I practiced law for 31 years, so it's an area that fascinates me. The defendants were not represented by attorneys. The defendants could defend themselves, meaning that they could present their own arguments and question witnesses, but really, how many people could do that effectively? These were mostly poor, uneducated farmers. Imagine trying to defend yourself in a terrifying situation where it seemed that most of the town was screaming for your blood. The major problem was that the courts allowed spectral evidence. What was that? In the 1600s, people believed in specters. A specter was kind of like a ghost. The difference is that a ghost is an active agent of somebody who died. A specter is a ghost-like creature acting on behalf of a living witch. A specter looks just like that particular witch. Unfortunately for the accused, the only people that could see a specter were the individuals who were being tormented by it. Since people believed that nobody else could see the specter other than the afflicted person, there was no way to verify whether or not the specter of the defendant was actually torturing the accuser. Since the courts accepted spectral evidence, this was a rigged system. If you wanted to target somebody, all you had to do was claim that that person's specter came to you from time to time and would physically torture you. Since there was no way to corroborate one way or the other, most of these cases came down to a she said, she said. And I'm putting it that way because most of the accusers and most of the defendants were women. Who would the court believe? Juries believed the accusers. Imagine this. Somebody from the town that you don't get along with accuses you of being a witch. In front of other people, this accuser screams and writhes in agony and claims that they could see your specter tormenting them. Things don't look very good for you. How do you defend yourself against such a claim other than your own denial? Now, the prosecutors talk to people who already confessed to being witches and are rotting in jail. Those people haven't been hanged, but they haven't been released. It's understood that the only thing keeping those in jail from being hanged is their cooperation with the prosecutors. So now the prosecutors talked to these confessed witches and asked if they ever saw you at any of these demonic rituals with the devil. Of course, some say yes. The people who have already confessed did so literally to save their own necks. When people are facing an imminent trip to the gallows, they will often accuse anybody and say anything to avoid being hanged. We know of at least one teenage girl who confessed to being a witch, who then testified that her grandfather was also a witch. Now let's think about this one. Margaret Jacobs was 16 years old when she was arrested for witchcraft along with her grandfather, George Jacobs. To save herself, she confessed, but also testified against her grandfather. After her grandfather was condemned to be hanged, Margaret had a change of heart and wrote to the judges retracting her confession as well as her testimony against her grandfather. This denial of her earlier testimony against her grandfather did not save him, but it did transfer Margaret back to the list of people to be tried as a witch. Spoiler, she stayed in jail until the witch trial stopped and was not executed as a witch. Not everybody acted in their own self-interest. The people who were actually hanged all refused to confess and refused to accuse anybody else. We all like to think that we would act nobly and simply go to the hanging tree rather than turn on our relatives, friends, or townspeople. We're lucky we've never been faced with such a horrible choice. One man understood that the game was rigged. His name was Giles Corey. When he was accused of being a witch and dragged into court, he refused to cooperate. Giles Corey understood that all of the accused were guilty until proven innocent. The prosecutor and the judges told him that he had to plead either guilty or not guilty, but he refused. It seems he did not want to plead guilty to save his life at the cost of accusing other people who would then lose their lives. But Giles Corey also understood that if he pled not guilty, he would certainly be convicted based upon the ludicrous spectral evidence. So he simply refused to cooperate with the trial. And so what did the prosecutors and judges do to Mr. Corey? They had him laid down on the ground and put a board over his body and started adding heavy stones to the board to make him plead either guilty or not guilty. They were literally pressuring him into entering a plea. He refused to speak, so they kept adding more stones. According to the records, the only thing he said when they asked him how he pled was, "More weight." Eventually, he was crushed to death, presumably dying from being suffocated by all the weight on his chest. This was definitely a warning to everybody else in Salem Village and the surrounding area. If you don't play by the rules, you might get killed without even being convicted. So how did it all end? There was a cycle of accusations and executions that seemed to be feeding on each other. Eventually, people in Boston and other parts of the colony thought that this was getting way out of hand. So outsiders stepped in and changed the trial procedures. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed. Without spectral evidence, how could anybody be convicted since, in reality, none of these people were actually practicing witchcraft? On October 29, 1692, William Phipps, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, closed the special court which was trying the alleged witches. Supposedly, what prompted the governor to close the court was because his own wife was accused of being a witch. Some further witch trials occurred later in May of 1693 in a regular court, but it was difficult to convict somebody without spectral evidence. There were no more convictions of witches. This essentially ended the witch hysteria in Salem Village and the surrounding area. In the 1950s, Arthur Miller wrote a play called The Crucible. It was based upon the Salem witchcraft trials, but it was not entirely accurate. A couple of movies have been made upon the Arthur Miller play. Miller wrote that play during the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings of suspected communists in America. Miller wrote the play to protest the way people were being accused of being communists and were practically guilty until proven innocent upon very flimsy hearsay evidence. Arthur Miller was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but he refused to name names. In other words, he refused to accuse anybody else like the accused witches of Salem did in 1692. So why did some people begin thrashing about and claim that they were being physically tortured and accused other people? At one point, some researchers claimed that it was drug-induced hallucinations. No, the Puritans were not doing recreational drugs, but the researchers thought that it was ergot poisoning from spoiled rye grain. Apparently, ergot poisoning is similar to the effects of LSD. This theory is pretty much rejected by most historians today because the hysterical fits came and went on the alleged victims. If they were actually suffering from ergot poisoning, you would think that the manifestations of the poisoning would be fairly continuous. Also, since they were all eating this same rye, you would think that everybody would be suffering from these conditions. But the screaming and writhing in pain seemed to come and go at convenient times when there was an audience and the supposedly afflicted people had the opportunity to accuse alleged witches. So that's why most historians don't believe the ergot poisoning theory. So if it wasn't poisoning, what caused these purported fits of agony and torment? It's very sad and very tragic to say, but it seems that they were just faking it. It all started with those two young girls, ages 9 and 11, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams. They were soon joined by 12-year-old Ann Putnam. Why'd they do it? Who knows? We have all been kids, and some of us have kids, and the simple answer as to why they do a lot of things is that they don't even know. Some think that the young girls were just enjoying the attention. In 1600s Puritan New England, children were not pampered or doted upon. They were not sent out in the yard to play. Kids were treated as servants. They were there to work and do as they were told. And adult women did not have it much better. Husbands were the absolute masters of the house. So, one theory is that these three young girls who started all the mess were bored and unhappy with their situation in life. and they could look at the adult women in the village and see that their lives were not going to get much better. So the theory goes that their actions started kind of as a game, but then they discovered that they had incredible power over the adults in Salem Village. Later on, adults started accusing people of being witches. It seems that a lot of the accusations from adults were based upon personal or political grudges. We'll never know why those 3 young girls did it or why the adults joined in the accusations. But let's not think of this as a wacky thing from the 1600s that couldn't happen today. On May 31, 2014, a 12-year-old girl in Wisconsin named Peyton Lautner was stabbed 19 times by 2 of her friends, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire. Why did Morgan and Anissa stab their friend Peyton? They told the police that Slender Man made them do it. Who's Slender Man? He's a fictional character created on a website called Creepypasta. He's tall and very thin in a black suit with very white skin and no facial features. In case you're wondering, Peyton Lautner somehow survived being stabbed 19 times and is alive today. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire were both confined to mental institutions. Anissa Wire was released in 2021, but Morgan Geyser is still in an institution. The reason I bring this up is that what they did was just as irrational as those young girls in Salem. Who knows why people do terrible things? Nobody can explain why Adam Lanza went into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut on December 14, 2012 and murdered 20 first graders along with 6 teachers and even his own mother. I won't give you a long list of such insane crimes. Just turn on the news on most nights and you can see horrible crimes that have no rational motive. So, don't get too concerned on why the first accusers did what they did in 1692 Salem Village. At least one of the accusers later made a confession and an apology. On August 25, 1706, which was 14 years after the witch hunts, Ann Putnam, who was then in her late 20s, submitted a written apology to the Salem Village Church, which was read to the congregation by the new pastor. The confession read as follows: I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92, that I, then being in my childhood, should, by such a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I justly fear I have been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself the guilt of innocent blood. Though what was said or done by me against any person, I can truly and uprightly say, before God and man, I did not out of any anger, malice, or ill will to any person, for I had no such thing against one of them, but what I did was ignorantly being deluded by Satan, and particularly as I was a chief instrument of accusing of good wife Nurse and her 2 sisters, I desire to lie in the dust, and to be humbled for it, in that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity to them and their families, for which cause I desire to lie in the dust, and earnestly beg forgiveness of God, and from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, whose relations were taken away or accused. When you think about it, in this confession, she doesn't really take responsibility for actions. She basically states that she was the unwitting tool of the devil. Ann Putnam accused 62 people of witchcraft. 17 of those were hanged. She later died single and alone at the age of 37. Ann Putnam was the only one of the accusers to offer any type of an apology. Some view her as sympathetic, not because of the apology, but because of her parents. Some historians believe that she was manipulated by her parents, who had personal and/or political grievances against some of the people that Ann Putnam accused. Ann's father, Thomas Putnam, seemed to be one of the ringleaders. He himself accused and testified against 43 people for the crime of witchcraft. Once the witch trials began, Thomas and his wife and daughter, who were both named Ann Putnam, by the way, testified in many of the trials. So what were the final casualty totals? 19 people were hanged as witches. One man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death under rocks for refusing to enter a plea, and 5 people died in jail from living in the appalling conditions. That means we have a total of 25 who died from this mass hysteria. More than 200 people were accused. It's unknown how many lives were completely ruined from this madness. There are no legal records of execution of animals in the Salem witchcraft hysteria, but some contemporary observers mentioned that at least 2 dogs were put to death, probably in Andover, Massachusetts, for being bewitched. We just don't have any details. We have to keep in mind that the condemned were actual people. To this end, here are the names of the 20 people who were executed in the witch mania of 1692. The first person to be executed was Bridget Bishop, who was hanged on June 10, 1692. On July 19, 1692, 5 people were hanged on the same day. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds. Although they were executed on the same day, each of those 5 women were hanged one at a time. The next month, 5 people were hanged on one day, on August 19, 1692. They were Martha Carrier, John Willard, John Proctor, George Jacob Sr. You may recall he was the older man whose 16-year-old granddaughter testified against him and later retracted her testimony. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough, and the testimony of others still condemned him to be hanged. The 5th person to be hanged on August 19th was the Reverend George Burroughs. Yes, George Burroughs was a minister, but that did not save his life. The execution of Reverend Burroughs was unique. When he climbed the ladder and the executioners were about to put the noose around his neck, he loudly recited the Lord's Prayer. He said the Our Father perfectly. This stunned the crowd that was there watching the hangings. There was a belief that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer, so some people thought this proved that he was innocent and should not be killed. But this did not save him, and they hanged him anyway. When they hanged people in groups on the same day, it was really bad to be the last one to be executed. If you were somebody like George Burroughs, you watched as they hanged the people before you, and each person was hanged individually. So you got to watch the person swinging at the end of the rope, slowly strangling to death as you waited your turn. This had to be gruesome. The last group of hangings occurred on one day, September 22, 1692. 8 people were executed on that date. Alice Parker was one of the people hanged. So was a woman named Mary Parker. It's unclear if they were related, but possibly through marriage. Anne Prudiator was also hanged on September 22nd, and so was a woman named Wilmot Red. Margaret Scott was also hanged that day, and they even threw in a man, not just all women. Samuel Wardwell was hanged. And rounding out the group on that last day of hangings were 2 more women, Martha Corey and Mary Easty. Those were the last hangings or executions of any kind in the Salem witch trials. You might have noticed from the names that this frenzy was mostly directed at women. Of the 19 people who were hanged, 14 were female. The Salem witch trials are an important reminder of the dangers of the combination of religious extremism, paranoia, and isolation. They also remind us about the importance of due process and how people should not be judged and convicted merely by unfounded accusations. Well, that's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help with the algorithms for the podcast apps. So if you're listening on an app like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I'd appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers about this podcast. Word of mouth is the best way to increase my audience. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to my podcast episodes, as well as fun items for history geeks like This Date in History, book recommendations, historical sound bites, photos of some of the subjects of certain episodes, and links to supporting historical evidence. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.